Visiting Southern California, President Donald Trump heads west amid the U.S. border battle. Campaign 2020. Democratic presidential candidates heat up the trail with promises of what they will bring to the American people. Good Friday dedication. We'll tell you the focus of this year's Stations of the Cross meditations and who will be writing them for the Pope. And St. Jerome in the Wilderness. The Vatican Museum's one and only Da Vinci is on display. We'll get an up-close and personal look at the masterpiece. On EWTN News Nightly for Friday, April 5th, 2019. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you for joining us for News from a Catholic Perspective. I'm Wyatt Goolsby, in for Lauren Ashburn. President Donald Trump visited the southern border today, renewing his push for greater security. In recent days, he's threatened to shut down the border and tax Mexico if the country doesn't stop the flow of Central American migrants coming to the U.S. border. White House correspondent Mark Irons has the latest. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Wyatt. This comes as another group of migrants, Venezuelans. Many of them already in the U.S. are waiting to see if the president will give them protection here. It's called temporary protected status. The Trump administration says a humanitarian crisis is occurring in Venezuela, so we asked the president if the U.S. will assist.
Temporary protected status for Venezuelans, will you give it to them? You said their country's in crisis.
Venezuela's a mess. This is what socialism brings. You elect a socialist here, you'll have the same exact countries you have in Venezuela.
The president not answering if temporary protected status, TPS, is needed for Venezuela. That designation would give its citizens the ability to legally live and work in the United States. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and Catholic Relief Services both call for 18 months of TPS protection for Venezuelans. They put out a joint statement yesterday saying there is no current TPS designation for Venezuela. However, conditions in the country and existing political instability have created a situation in which Venezuelan nationals cannot be safely returned home at this time. The president visited the U.S. southern border in Calexico, California today to view a long-planned replacement section of the wall. Before leaving, he backed off his plan to shut down the border because he says Mexico is apprehending more migrants in recent days, but his newest threat is to tax cars coming from Mexico if the country doesn't stop the flow of migrants.
I may shut it down at some point, but I'd rather do tariffs. So Mexico, I have to say, has been very, very good. You know that over the last 4 days since I talked about shutting down the border. If they continue that, everything will be fine.
The president is also floating the idea of placing some sort of economic penalty on Mexico due to the amount of illegal drugs that come from the country into the U.S. Wyatt?
Mark, the president now says he's withdrawing his nominee to lead U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. What can you tell us?
Well, the president surprised some administration officials with this decision. It means acting director of ICE, Ron Vitello, will no longer be the president's nominee. Now, President Trump did not indicate today who his new pick to run ICE would be. He only says he wants to go in a tougher direction. Wyatt?
White House correspondent Mark Irons reporting. Thanks, Mark. Protesters outside the White House call on China to stop persecuting Uyghur Muslims. Advocates say millions of members of the ethnic group have been killed or placed in concentration camps and forced to have abortions.
There's a misconception that China no longer has forced abortions. China does have forced abortions. They have a two-child policy, which is just as repulsive and insulting as a one-child policy.
Jason Jones is a Catholic filmmaker who promotes human dignity, especially for unborn babies. He calls the Uyghur the most vulnerable people in the world. Protest organizers want the U.S. to impose sanctions on Chinese leaders responsible for human rights violations. Former Vice President Joe Biden speaks in public for the first time since women accused him of unwanted physical contact. He attempted to brush off the accusations with humor. All this coming before he's even officially announced his campaign for president. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi reports. Good evening, Jason.
Wyatt, Biden's allies say he hasn't slowed down his plans for 2020. He's expected to officially jump into the race after Easter. Advisors say they're building their campaign, focusing on two states that could be key for him, Iowa and South Carolina. Today in D.C., he tried to win back the kind of blue-collar workers who voted for President Trump.
The 47th Vice President of the United States, Joe Biden.
Joe Biden's first public speech since women said he made them feel uncomfortable with his hugs, shoulder squeezes, and close-quarter whispers.
I just want you to know I had permission to hug Lonnie. We had permission. I don't know, man.
Only touched on the topic twice, both as jokes.
By the way, he gave me permission to touch him.
Biden rallied an important Democratic base, union members, while others already running for president speak on another important stage.
When we work and when we fight and when we march and when we speak up and when we offer solutions, we win.
California Senator Kamala Harris promises to double the size of the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division. The candidates court black voters at Reverend Al Sharpton's National Action Network, and they weigh reparations for descendants of slaves.
And we must apologize, and that apology should come from the Oval Office.
Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren.
I'm proposing a big structural change. Universal child care and early education for all our babies.
She also called for the end of the Senate's filibuster, which right now requires bills get 60 votes, not just a simple majority, to pass. It's not just liberals like Warren who want the filibuster gone. Pro-life lawmakers have told me they wish the Senate would have eliminated it when the GOP controlled both chambers here. They said that many pro-life laws could have been passed with just that simple majority of votes and then signed into law. Wyatt?
Jason, I understand Joe Biden took questions from the media today after his speech.
Right. He says he didn't intend to make light of the accusations. You just heard him making those jokes and people laughing at his comments. Biden adds he's very close to announce he'll run. And a new candidate just jumped into the 2020 Democratic race, Ohio Representative Tim Ryan. He was once pro-life, but since 2015 publicly he's been supporting abortion.
Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi reporting. Thanks, Jason. Brian Darling, president and founder of Liberty Government Affairs, joins me now to take a closer look at the crowded field of Democrats running for president. Brian, welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me on.
Former Vice President Joe Biden signaling we'll hear from him soon about whether he'd run for president, like Jason was reporting. How will these allegations of interaction with women that make some feel uncomfortable affect his chances?
I don't think they'll affect them that much. I mean, ultimately, Democrats are going to choose a person they think can beat Donald Trump. They also are focused on some big issues, big picture issues, and changing a lot of the policies in Washington, D.C. from the federal government. So I think they'll look more at the policies and who can beat Donald Trump more so than these allegations that'll probably pass in a few weeks.
Well, if Joe Biden runs, of course, as you know, he's in a party that holds very different views on progressive issues and can be very split on some of these. How do you think he sort of balances the divisions even within the party?
Well, it seems like there aren't that many divisions in one sense. It seems like there's one moderate, Joe Biden, and there are a lot of progressives running. I mean, a new progressive seems to jump in every day. So he is providing an alternative for Democrats that don't want to go for the heavily progressive Green New Deal programs that are being promoted by almost all the candidates who have announced to date.
Let's switch, because I want to get your take on President Trump's push to keep border security at the forefront, as Mark Irons was reporting earlier. In recent days, the president has threatened to shut down the border with Mexico. How does that help the president politically, or does it, or is that even what he's thinking about at this point?
Well, the president clearly wants to motivate his base. He's focused on immigration as an issue that gets his voters excited, and I think the American people do look at that issue as a very important issue they want to deal with. So he's put a focus on that issue and not really talked about a lot of the other good news that's been coming out, good economic news and other news that he could be promoting. So he's all about immigration right now.
Just speaking of that, he says he's now considering applying tariffs to cars made in Mexico. How do you think that could impact trade deals? I mean, I know there was a trade deal reached last year between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. It's not in effect yet, but how could that potentially impact trade among these North American countries?
Well, that U.S., Mexico, and Canada trade deal hasn't passed the Senate yet. It needs to be implemented by the Senate. That's going to be tough to do because Democrats don't want to give the president a win. But he has used a strategy of threatening tariffs to try and leverage better free trade agreements with different nations. And I think a lot of the tough talk is in anticipation of getting a better deal and some better negotiating strategies, a better negotiating position with countries like Mexico, and maybe get them to be a little bit tougher on immigration.
Has that worked in the past? I mean, does having tough talk with these other countries work or get somewhere?
Well, it has. It got China to the table. We've seen a lot of talks where he's threatened very tough sanctions on China and raising tariffs on China, and it has brought them to the table. Now, ultimately, the goal is to get a better deal, and we haven't seen that come out with China yet. But the long-term goal is talk tough, and threaten very tough sanctions and negotiations and tariffs on these countries. And he did that with Canada too. It did bring Canada and Mexico to renegotiate NAFTA. Hopefully it'll work with China and other nations.
Okay, and certainly we'll be watching to see how it plays out with Mexico as well. Brian Darling, President and founder of Liberty Government Affairs, thanks so much for your analysis.
Thank you.
The CEO of Boeing says the company is making fixes to the 737 MAX airplane, 2 of which have been involved in deadly crashes in the past several months.
It's our responsibility to eliminate this risk. We own it, and we know how to do it.
CEO Dennis Muhlenberg says the company is fixing the anti-stall system accused of playing a role in the Ethiopian Airlines crash last month that killed 157 people. Last October, 189 people were killed following a crash in Indonesia. Opposition supporters in Turkey were elated after their candidate won the mayoral election last Sunday in Istanbul, but now they're worried the results could be overturned. The race is headed to a recount after the ruling party challenged the results. The opposition leader said on social media this morning he still leads by more than 18,000 votes. If he holds on and is able to win, it would be an unexpected setback for President Erdogan. There's another tight election going on, this one upcoming in Israel. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is in a close race, and he's playing a trump card of sorts. Netanyahu's billboards and social media videos reportedly all heavily feature President Donald Trump. Next Tuesday's vote is seen as a referendum on Netanyahu's decade-long rule. Challenger Benny Gantz, the Prime Minister's former Army Chief of Staff, trails by a slight margin. Pope Francis is dedicating his Good Friday meditations this year to victims of human trafficking. He's asked an Italian nun who rescues migrant women to compose the prayers. They will be read aloud during the Stations of the Cross at Rome's Colosseum on April 19th. A group of international lawyers who are pushing to overturn laws making homosexuality illegal met with the Vatican's Secretary of State today. In a statement, the Vatican said Cardinal Pietro Parolin received approximately 50 persons working on the issue. The Cardinal extended a brief greeting to them, quote, repeating the Catholic Church's position in defense of the dignity of every human person and against every form of violence. Alan Holdren is the EWTN Rome Bureau Chief. Alan, this group talked to reporters right after the meeting with the Cardinal. What are they looking for from the Vatican?
Well, Wyatt, they'd like support for what they're doing to try to overturn these laws against homosexuality in different countries around the world. Or at the very least, they'd like the church to not interfere as they try to overturn these laws. They said that they have research that shows a correlation in these nations between where the laws are present against homosexuality and violence against homosexuals in those same societies. They said that they gave that research to the Cardinal Secretary of State, and the Cardinal said that he would be passing that along to the Holy Father. They didn't actually release that yet. They said that it's not quite finished and that they gave the Secretary of State a preliminary draft of that research.
Pope Francis is often described as being more open on the issue of homosexuality. What exactly has he said in the past?
Well, as we know, Pope Francis has made mercy a hallmark of his pontificate. We know that in 2013, he spoke about homosexuals in the Vatican, saying, "Who am I to judge?" But later on, he said that what he meant by that was that he was paraphrasing the Catechism of the Catholic Church, basically to say that every person has human dignity. In 2018, he stuck by the Church's tradition in saying that those who are preparing themselves for the priesthood should, if they exhibit strong, deep-seated homosexual tendencies, shouldn't be allowed to continue on to become priests. He also just last week was giving an interview to a Spanish journalist, and he said to parents with children whom they think may be exhibiting homosexual tendencies, ask them to not pass judgment on them, but to take them in for a psychological assessment.
In their statement, the Vatican says the Cardinal repeated the Catholic Church's position on the dignity of every human person. What exactly is the Church's teaching on that?
Well, in its catechism, the Catholic Church teaches that, that homosexual acts are intrinsically disordered, that they're against the natural law and are immoral, but that those who exhibit homosexual tendencies are to be treated with respect and compassion, that they have equal dignity to all other people. In 2008, actually, Wyatt, there was a speech given at the United Nations by a Holy See delegate saying that in cases where there are laws against homosexuality, that they should be decriminalized, that all people who exhibit these tendencies should be treated with respect. So the Vatican has already come out and said that they're against these laws. I spoke with a theologian in Rome today who said that the Church really walks a difficult sort of a tightrope in these cases, because the Church has to be charitable, has to treat people with dignity, but it also can't go against its own teaching. So that's something that we see playing out here, is that it's really difficult for the Church to express really what its teaching is in this current environment, but it remains what it has always been.
Sounds like a very important message, too, just continuing to follow up on the respect and nonviolence. Alan Holdren, EWTN Rome Bureau Chief, thanks so much for talking with us.
Thank you, White.
Coming up, the Pope's prayer intentions for the month of April.
Presente en zonas de guerra.
Pope Francis releases his prayer intention for the month of April, asking the faithful to pray for doctors and medical professionals who work in war-torn areas, risking their lives to save others. Welcome back. I'm Wyatt Goolsby, in for Lauren Ashburn. Emails show Planned Parenthood is behind a California rule to make churches pay for abortions. In 2014, state law forces religious groups, including churches, to cover elective abortions for employees. Yesterday, 3 churches filed a notice of appeal against the measure. Joining me now to discuss this story is Edward Condon, Washington, D.C. Bureau for Catholic News Agency. Ed, what do these emails from Planned Parenthood actually say?
Well, it's an entire email chain that's been submitted to the Ninth Circuit as part of the evidence in this notice of appeal. And what they show is systematic communication between Planned Parenthood officials and California state officials at the Department of Health and Human Services. And what they show is systematic checking in by Planned Parenthood on state officials to make sure they're complying with their demands and basically threatening them with a legislative campaign if they don't comply.
Pretty disturbing, especially for a lot of pro-lifers to hear about this. Do they specifically mention Catholic churches or Catholic universities?
Absolutely. At this point in 2014, what had happened was 2 Catholic universities, Loyola Marymount and Santa Clara universities, had their health care plans for their employees approved by the state authorities, and these didn't cover elective abortions. But this wasn't good enough for Planned Parenthood, and they came back and said, unless you close this loophole, unless you have this fix, as they called it, we are going to trigger a whole legislative campaign to close this loophole ourselves. So either they said to the Department of Health and Human Services, you fix this or we're going to.
What do you think this says about Planned Parenthood and lobbyists for Planned Parenthood that they would go this far? We suspected this, but...
I think what's really disturbing about these emails is it shows the level of interference they can play, not just in the legislative process, not just in public campaigns, but behind the scenes, meeting with state officials and effectively operating as a check over their shoulder to make sure they're all reading from the same script. It shows the level of complicity in some areas. And I mean, it's very worrying that state officials are willing to bow to this kind of pressure.
So where do we go from here? What's next?
Well, the notice of appeal has been given to the U.S. Ninth Circuit. We'll see the case come up there. Hopefully we can get more will come to light. We'll understand more about this, and hopefully we can claw back a measure of religious freedom in California.
Okay, well, we'll continue to be watching this because this is still developing here. And of course, we'll ask our followers, of course, to continue to follow Catholic News Agency as you guys give updates as well. Edward Condon, with the Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief for Catholic News Agency. Thanks so much for the update.
My pleasure.
Lawmakers in Arkansas pass a bill requiring a 72-hour abortion waiting period, meaning women must wait 72 hours between talking to a doctor about the procedure and getting the abortion. The pro-life bill now heads to the state's Republican governor, who is expected to sign it. 5 states already have 72-hour waiting periods. And in Tennessee, the state's House passes a bill giving legal protection to adoption agencies that won't place children with same-sex couples. The measure now heads to the state Senate. The Republican governor has not said yet if he's in favor of the bill. Up next, a private tour of a Vatican Museum masterpiece. Welcome back. I'm Wyatt Goolsby, in for Lauren Ashburn. The state of Texas has banned all prison chaplains from its execution chamber. The move comes after the U.S. Supreme Court halted the death of a Buddhist prisoner who was denied the presence of a minister because the minister was not a state employee. The state currently only employs Christian and Muslim clerics. For more on this story, including what the newest Justice Brett Kavanaugh said about the case, visit our partners at CatholicNewsAgency.com. The president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints ends a ban on baptisms for children of same-sex couples. Russell Nelson also says same-sex couples will no longer be labeled as sinners eligible for expulsion. The Utah-based Mormon Church has 16 million followers worldwide. Finally tonight, the Vatican is celebrating Leonardo da Vinci, the Renaissance genius who died 500 years ago. The Vatican Museums is sharing its only work of da Vinci's with the world. Tonight, Barbara Yatta, the first woman to run the Vatican Museums, gives us our own private tour.
This is San Jerome in the Wilderness, made by Leonardo da Vinci, and is the only painting in the Vatican collections, and is the only painting in Rome made by Leonardo. The iconography of San Jerome in these paintings is San Girolamo Penitente. Is suffering, and it's a very, very incredible example for us. This year, 2019, is the 500 years celebration of Leonardo's death. And we thought, as the Vatican Museum has the fact that it's the only painting in Rome, is the only painting in the Vatican collections, to use and to share these incredible masterpieces of art with pilgrims, visitors, and art historians that can come for free in the heart of the Vatican City State, in the heart of St. Peter's Square. Leonardo really is the example that God can give to one person so many talents.
This unfinished masterpiece will travel to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City this July, and then to the Louvre in Paris before returning to the Vatican. And that wraps up our newscast for tonight and for this week. We thank you for watching and hope you have a blessed weekend. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Wyatt Goolsby. We'll be back on Monday with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night, and God bless.